Alright, hello everyone, and welcome to this week's episode of the OSINT Bunker podcast. It is I, OSINTtechnical, and I am alone this week. All by myself. It's nothing serious. Everyone has just had scheduling conflicts over the weekend, and I am the one who didn't necessarily draw the short straw, but decided to just move ahead and record on my own. So you're all going to have to listen to me alone as I record this episode. So I'm just going to keep it probably short and sweet this week. There have been some major events and updates. I particularly want to talk about Ukraine, and I think because John isn't here, I'll sort of have time to actually process my own thoughts, which is nice, and I'll be able to talk about it. I know he's listening to this right now as he sort of reviews over it, and he's probably cringing to himself as I sort of have free reign to talk about what I want to. But I just wanted to dive into sort of what's been happening over the past few months, and I'm eventually going to build up to the current happenings and current Russian offensive in the Avdiivka area, and sort of go over what's happening there. But I just wanted to start out by going over a statement recently by the U.S. Embassy in Kiev. And I think it's really good because it sort of encapsulates one of the major elements of this winter's events, and that is the fact that it's the end of winter right now, or we're really getting into the end of winter, and Ukraine has electricity. The Russian campaign to deprive Ukraine of their energy infrastructure, if they were planning it this year, has completely failed. Last year, the Ukrainian electrical grid almost completely melted down under sustained Russian attacks, and not only that, but people were running off of car batteries and generators, and no one had power, no one had heating. The grid had effectively just ceased to really exist as Russia just targeted numerous substations. They were throwing Shaheds and cruise missiles at Russian power at Ukrainian power generation capabilities, and it got really bad, especially towards the beginning of spring. And this year we haven't seen that. Ukrainian power generation capabilities have been more or less online. There have been very few outages, maybe just a couple that have coincided with Russian attacks this year, and only really blocked power generation capabilities for a very limited amount of time. And so as we see things sort of lead into sort of spring and summer, as weather gets warmer and generally power generation requirements sort of descend a bit, I think we can say that Ukraine sort of made it out into the woods on that part. Less covered has been more Black Sea activity. We're seeing a continued Ukrainian supply chain and continued Ukrainian capabilities to secure the export of grain and other goods through the Black Sea corridor. The Russians have fairly clearly sort of lost that ability to control the area, as Ukrainian forces, whether it be through USVs or anti-ship missiles, continue to possess that capability to both attack Russian ships. We saw another Russian Rapucha class sunk by Ukrainian USVs off the coast of Crimea. As it effectively appears, if a Russian ship is operating alone in the area, they're very vulnerable to Ukrainian USV attack, which is almost certainly limiting the Russians' capability to actually put together any sort of campaign in the Northwest Black Sea region, which just gives the Ukrainians some reprieve on that end. And then, of course, I think, as everyone has been focusing on over the past few days, the recent Russian push into the western area of Avdiivka. Right now, it seems that Ukrainian forces are trying to either hold or reestablish a line west of the city. We've seen fairly heavy fighting. Based on reports from primarily Ukrainian sources, which obviously never trust 100%, it does seem like they or the main restriction they have is their lack of hardened actual built up defenses. Right now, they're currently fighting in the eastern suburbs of Orlivka, which is a town sort of west down the road of the Avdiivka coal plant. One of the issues that Ukrainian bloggers were talking about, and these were relatively well placed bloggers, was the fact that Russian infantry have been able to sort of sneak past what are arguably loose Ukrainian defenses into Orlivka, and then Ukrainian forces continually have to sort of mop it up. Right now, the 25th Airborne Brigade, the Ukrainian 25th Airborne Brigade, has been newly deployed to the area, and they've been involved in some heavy fighting in Orlivka. What we're seeing, at least through video evidence, both from Orlivka and a bit north of it in Berdiki, has been basically Ukrainian forces are able to put some amount of fire down onto any Russian sort of mechanized attack. Whether it be up in Berdiki, where we saw the sort of a number of BTR-80s destroyed by Ukrainian FPV munitions, or down in Orlivka, where we saw sort of those Russian BMPs moving towards the town, get engaged pretty heavily by Ukrainian armor. I think we're seeing a degree where Ukrainian forces are sort of able to counter the larger Russian assets that are more obvious, where they're able to put long range fires on them. But at the same time, when dealing with Russian infantry moving on foot, they're able to slip past what are arguably weaker Ukrainian defenses on the ground. Right now, and I sort of looking at a map, there is sort of a natural defensive line created by this chain of lakes and a small river that sort of runs through the area, that to the west of it, the Ukrainians would possess high ground and sort of limited Russian avenues for advance. I think it's likely that Ukrainian forces withdraw past that and sort of try to hold the line at the river, because what they're trying to do is sort of reestablish firm defensive positions that don't allow Russian infantry to move through. It would have to be bounded on the northern end by sort of a weaker defensive area, but the 47th Mechanized has proven to be fairly effective in sort of holding that area up by Berdiki. So that's probably what we'll see happen. Over the past few days, the Russians did make a fairly rapid advance west out of Avdiivka, but I would expect the Ukrainians to at least try to hold that line. It does give the Russians some space to the west of Odein to sort of push across open fields. At the same time, though, Ukrainian forces have proven to counter sort of those mechanized assaults well. It's really the problem is going to be where the Russians try to push forward infantry, especially dismounted infantry into what are arguably very weak Ukrainian positions. That's probably what we'll continue to see over the next few weeks. It really does depend on whether or not Ukrainian forces are able to hold that line. And on that subject, one of the main issues has been the lack of artillery shells. The lack of Ukrainian shelling is fairly evident in the videos they've been releasing. The quantity of Ukrainian shelling has been remarkably low, and that almost certainly comes from the lack of foreign supplied shells. Ukrainian bloggers have talked about that. Ukrainian soldiers have talked about that. Ukrainian leadership has talked about that. It's been a huge issue. The Czech Republic is currently leading an effort to try to counter that by supplying the Ukrainian government with at least a fair number of shells. I mean, something like 200,000 or more as soon as possible. And various European governments are supporting that. I believe at this point the Dutch government, the Netherlands, and I believe Canada, the UK, and some other governments have all signed on And sorry, I just talked about this yesterday on my Twitter account, so I'll just scroll back there to look. But it's Belgium, the United Kingdom, the Netherlands, Denmark, Canada, and Sweden have all signed on to the Czech-led effort. I know that Belgium and the Netherlands have each donated 200 million euros to that effort. So that's a fair number of shells that each of them are supplying, and should, if the Czech government is able to sort of rush order those and get them transported as quick as possible, I assume that we'll probably start to see them hit the battlefield this month. That being March. I know we're recording this right at the end of February here. I think moving into the near future, we'll probably sort of see that. The U.S. is currently debating some other political methods to procure weapons and armament for Ukraine that sort of go around a traditional procurement, whether that be using seized Russian funds or digging into a bit of additional USAI money that may perhaps be available, a bit other $4 billion of that. We're also seeing some congressional movement. A discharge petition was just was just declared. Well, sorry, I why am I forgetting the specific term for? It's not the discharge petition getting passed or invoked, but it's been started. So that we'll probably see continue to move into the near future, and Congress may deal with that, though they are scheduled to go on recess, so that may take a bit longer. And we may see some executive action in the meantime in the U.S. as well as European support. And then on that side of things, we also saw a lot of sort of posturing this week, especially from France, on potential physical on-the-ground deployment, whether that be direct support of Ukraine or even increased support in Eastern Europe. The French have increased the size of their battle group in Romania. They're adding about 50 Leclerc tanks to that. It's a NATO battle group that's currently French-led, but they're increasing their deployment there. Additionally, they sort of spoke about potential deployments into Ukraine to support the Ukrainian government in a non-combat role, though that is most likely just political maneuvering at this point. I doubt we see anything sort of significant related to that. I don't believe that has any sort of future, at least in the near future, especially as Russia continues to posture sort of with their nuclear threats. On that side of things, we also saw, very interestingly, some leaked Russian war plans for their Eastern Military District, which is responsible for sort of the Russian Pacific area, and especially their border with China. And it really showed a couple of things. I mean, one, it showed that Russia's a baseline for utilizing tactical nuclear weapons in a pure fight is a bit lower than we thought it was, probably. In that they're more willing to conduct strikes if things really start to go south for them tactically, which in a war with China would probably happen pretty quickly. The Russian Navy also appears to be very involved in that tactical employment of nuclear weapons. And so they seem to war game that out fairly heavily. And shows sort of how they're still concerned about, potential Chinese issues. I think that the Russian-China relationship has maybe been a bit overstated over the past year or two, in that, sure, China is willing to give Russia or fund Russia and supply them with UTVs, basically, maybe some technology, but it's mostly sold to them, and it's mostly, I'm not going to say China is profiteering off the war, but there's certainly a level to which China is both selling to Russia and Ukraine. I mean, providing tacit diplomatic support to a degree, but nothing too serious. Unlike North Korea, which is directly supplying arms, artillery, long-range ballistic missiles. and sort of assets that Russia is using to directly attack Ukraine, whereas Chinese aid has been far more moot and much more transactional in nature, where we just see sort of sales going on to both Ukraine and Russia. Moving on to the Middle East, the efforts or recent efforts to attempt to put together a ceasefire have been more or less ineffective. There was some hope that a 6-week ceasefire could be agreed to this weekend, and that fell apart pretty quickly. There was an incident today, and that's probably underselling what happened, but Israeli vehicles tried to enter the Gaza Strip with aid or with food supplies, and they were swarmed by what are objectively starving Palestinians. And there was a stampede. Reportedly shots fired from the Palestinian side, but that's unclear what actually happened there. But the Israeli government did admit that they fired at Palestinians who were in the area and trying to get food from the trucks. It's unsure exactly what had happened. The Israelis released a very short clip, or a very short series of clips from a drone in the area that showed a crowd of Palestinians attempting to get the material that the trucks were carrying, mostly food. And there was fairly obviously a stampede for it. That was a fairly horrifying event in total. And then in the Red Sea, we saw an increase in Houthi missile attacks and drone attacks. The Germans have gotten involved. Very quickly attempted to shoot down a U.S. Reaper over the Red Sea, though that appears to have been just an identity mix-up in the area. But obviously that reveals some of the issues of non-Prosperity Guardian affiliated efforts to counter Houthi drones in the area, just because it's relying off a different command. There's no coordination of resources, which will result in misidentifications like that. The Germans did successfully shoot down a drone, engaging it with their RIM 116, which is a very short range defensive missile system. Almost, it's effectively Sea-Whiz but with a missile. And so we saw them make that interception. We did also see a successful Houthi attack against a bulk carrier that is currently in the process of sinking. It's most likely going to sink. There are active salvage efforts, but the ship is taken on a very large amount of water, and I really do not expect it to actually be a salvaged vessel. It's in a fairly bad state right now. I think that's most of the stuff that we covered for this week. I know I would normally ask everyone else to chip in with their observations about what happened this week, but I've been left alone, and that's basically my coverage for this week's OSINT Bunker podcast. Thank you everyone for listening. I know just listening to me alone might be a bit hard, but I thank everyone for listening, and we will be back in 2 weeks' time.